All right, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to get on to our next topic, which are the Punic Wars. Last time we kind of left off talking about the rise of the Roman Republic and how the Roman Republic began to flourish and grow. And one of the core ideas we were discussing are those Roman values, their ability to adopt and adapt, solve problems. They're all those key core characteristics of them that help them grow and succeed. And so when we left off last time, we were talking about how they started to expand through Italy, and I mentioned this other opponent of theirs, Carthage. And this is going to lead to three Punic Wars. And these conflicts between Rome and Carthage will have an important impact on the course of Western civilization history. And so we're going to go through all three of these wars. I'll probably do three short lectures for each one of them. And you'll need to know all three, but again, the focus is not just knowing the names and the events, but connecting how these wars show Rome's ability to adapt, adopt, solve problems in order for them to eventually be the dominant winner of this. And of course, kind of spoiler alert, they're going to win. And you probably know that simply by asking yourself how many people have heard of Rome versus how many people have heard of Carthage. And pretty much everyone's heard of Rome, and not quite as many people have heard of Carthage, even though Carthage was a significant civilization. All right, so let's start by looking at our map here. And just kind of this map is going to help remind us of what we're talking about. When we start talking about Rome, we've talked about how it expanded from the tiny little dot in Rome to taking control of all of Italy. We talked about the war, the issue over Tarentum, the kingdom of Epirus and Pyrrhus, and all of that was from the last lecture. And I also mentioned Carthage is located right over here in North Africa. And so Carthage had an incredibly strong navy. I believe I've already given you some of the characteristic of the infantry of Rome. They had a very strong army, strong legions, strong ground forces. But Carthage had a navy that was very powerful. And that's going to be very important to remember as we go through the three Punic Wars, and especially this first one, as you're going to see what it's all about. So let me go to my next slide. I'll give you the key words, and then after I give you the key words, we'll kind of talk about the First Punic War, and then I'll do another lecture on the Second Punic War, and then do a short one on the Third Punic War. All right, so again, that's just kind of the map to help you kind of sort out where everything is again, and I'll bring up the map too again as we talk about things. All right, so here are our key words. All right, so here are your key terms for this, or key words, I should say, for this lecture, the First Punic War. Carthage, which of course already mentioned, showed you where it is. You have the dates. You never need to memorize the exact dates, of course. These are just, time periods on circa 250 BC, you're fine. Sicily, which I'll explain, Raven, which I'll explain, Corsica and Sardinia, which I'll explain, all key terms that you need to know. And again, as always, you're not just writing down the words, you're writing the details and connecting it with the broader ideas that we've talked about in previous lectures. All right, so, and if anybody happens to be watching this not for the class, it's still kind of just interesting to learn about these Punic Wars. They're actually a lot of fun, especially when we get to the second one in the next lecture. All right, so let's go to our map here and kind of talk about the First Punic War. And remember, I already mentioned Carthage had a really strong navy. And this First Punic War is basically fought for control of Sicily. And, the whole thing is Sicily is an island, remember. And so when the First Punic War begins, it's going to be Carthage that probably has the advantage. They have a stronger navy. It's a very powerful navy, very well advanced, and therefore not a surprise when the war begins, Carthage is doing a bit better than Rome. So the question is, how do the Romans turn the tide in this war? And I always like asking my students this in class: what would you do if you're the Romans? These Carthaginian ships are beating you, and eventually somebody comes up with an idea that the Romans come up with: adopt and adapt, copy the ships that Carthage used. And so we do have accounts of how there was an old beat up Carthaginian ship that was run ashore. The Romans found it and said, well, if these are the ships that are beating us, we'll just copy their ships. And so they started with that. The other thing the Romans did is they were really disciplined. Remember, that was one of the other characteristics I told you about the Romans. Very disciplined. So they would sit on the ground rowing hours for unison, day in and day out, before they even got on these boats. So they would row and practice, and then they would, get on these new ships, and then they would train close to their coastline, and then they said, all right, now we're ready to go and fight the Carthaginian navy with our better ships and our better trained navy men and so forth, and they're still not having the best success. They're doing better, and so there's some battles Rome wins, some battles Carthage wins, but then the Romans come up with something pretty cool, and it's actually something accounted to us by a Roman historian named Polybius, who describes this device that the Romans created to help them win this First Punic War. And what they're basically going to try to do is change these sea battles to land battles while they're still on sea. And to do that, they create that device known as a raven. Now, what is it? I used to, when I first started to teach, I would, explain it. I would read the primary source, and I would, read it verbatim and, try to describe. And then I found pictures, and pictures actually help for this. So this is essentially what the raven is. Take a look at this next image. It's basically kind of a boarding plane for ships. And so this is imagine this being a Roman ship, and it would be a plank here, and it would be tied with a series of levers and pulleys and so forth, and it would drop onto the Carthaginian ship. It's got this hook here. Let me show you on another image here. You can see a little bit more detail. And so here, this is actually a much better view of it. You could see, how it would go, and it would turn. You could see how it could turn in different directions. It would get on the Carthaginian ship, and then you can move your forces and change the sea battle to a land battle. And this was effective. There's historians dispute how big of a deal it was. Some say it helped a lot, some say it helped not so much. But at the end of the day, it's a good example of Roman ingenuity and their ability to adapt and adopt and solve problems. So they first copy the Carthaginian ship, they create the Raven, and eventually, and sometimes it's also called the Crow, by the way, if you see it referred to as the Crow, same thing. Eventually, they get the upper hand, and what ends up happening is the Romans win the First Punic War. They end up taking control of Sicily, and eventually take control of those two other islands I put as those other key words, Corsica and Sardinia. And really begin to expand the influence of Rome around the Mediterranean Sea. And just a little side note, I don't know if anybody knows this, but there's somebody really important that comes from Corsica, and it's a guy named Napoleon. Of course, that's in my modern Western Civ class, History 111. I love talking about Napoleon. People think he's from France. Well, he obviously ruled over France, but technically he was from Corsica. So anyways, they take over Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and really begin to get some momentum. And you say, all right, is that the end of our story? And the answer is not at all, because yes, the Romans win the First Punic War, but as we go a couple generations further, Carthage is about to develop pretty strong leadership as well. And one of the strongest leaders of Carthage is about to emerge, and he is going to push Rome to the edges. And you are going to see what this one man does that really brings tremendous fear into the hearts of many Romans. And so we'll talk about the Second Punic War and who this really remarkable military man of Carthage was in our next lecture. All right, so I hope that's clear. You got lecture 1 on the Punic Wars, and lecture 2 is about to pop up next for you. All right, thank you.